The Nintendo 64 has been around for over 23 years now, which is crazy to think about, considering I remember getting it when I was a little wee child. I put in many hours into this system, and still do today. It's got a special place in my heart. Although one of the biggest contentions with the N64 was the controversy around its controller. This controller was not really widely accepted by the public due to its strange nature and three-pronged design. Almost looks like it belongs on top of Aquaman's trident. But I've grown fond of this little guy over the years. So there are a lot of companies out there who have gone out of their way to create other controllers that you can use with your Nintendo 64. So I wanted to go on a journey today to take a look at a few of those. Let's start with the original. Tried and true N64 controller. Now, as I mentioned before, this little guy has a lot of harsh opinions on him. A lot of people who grew up with the Nintendo 64 will still see this as their go-to choice. It's a wonderful little controller, and it holds up aside from the little wear and tear on the stick. And a lot of other people will be like, I don't know what that thing is, I don't know how that works, why does it look like a little fork? I'm gonna use it to eat dinner. One of the biggest things that people talk about is the weird little three-pronged design. But what's interesting about that is it sort of has this dynamic sense to it. It was Nintendo's true jump into full 3D control. It was sort of a first step for them. And it's a strange way to handle it, but I do like the way they did it. They weren't quite sure how it was going to transition from using a D-pad for 2D games over to using the new controller joystick for full analog control in 3D games. Man, that was like the biggest selling point back in the 90s, was that Mario was in full analog control. It has these three prongs because they initially wanted to make it so when you were using the analog stick for leading a game, you would hold on to the middle prong. But for some games, which only ended up being a few select titles such as Kirby and the Crystal Shards and Mischief Makers, you would hold on to it from the outside as if it was a standard Nintendo controller. One of the more interesting factoids that I've noticed about this controller is someone once pointed out that the middle prong is very eerily similar to the nunchuck from the Nintendo Wii. Seems like Nintendo knew what they were doing, even down to having the Z button. I've always loved the original N64 controller. Sure, it's a little bit short with just a 6-foot cable, but it's the tried and true way that was meant to be played with the system. Everything on that console is built around this little guy. The next one I want to talk about is the Brawler 64. The Brawler 64 was released by Retro Fighters only a short while ago. It was an attempt to modernize the look on the N64 controller, and comes in multiple color variations. I only have the standard gray one, but you could buy them in multiple fantastic colors such as red, blue, orange, and smoke gray. I'm a big fan of the way that it feels in your hands as a controller. I've got pretty big hands myself, so getting to hold something that feels more like a modern-sized controller has been pretty comfortable. And the stick itself is not a plastic-on-plastic situation anymore, so it won't wear out anytime soon. It's made with flatter matte buttons and has a full matte finish, which you may personally like. It's not quite my thing. I've learned that I prefer the glossier look of the original controller, but they have a nice press to it. Yeah, you hear that? Good. One of the interesting aspects of this one is that it has two Z triggers on the back of it, which can make it a much more comfortable experience depending on the game that you're playing. Another thing this controller has is a turbo button, which is found on a lot of third-party controllers. I don't find myself using it very often, but it's there if you decide you want to use it. Although I will say one thing I'm not super thrilled with is they're meant to emulate that analog feeling of like an Xbox or PlayStation controller, which is cool for the sense of the modern feeling, but considering that the N64's button inputs are strictly digital, it sort of feels like there's a little bit of travel time there. Although all in all, when actually using it on the system, I almost hardly notice it. Now, for those of you who know about third-party N64 controllers, you might have heard about the HoriPad Mini. It was a Japanese exclusive controller that many seem to think is the best 64 controller on the market. Although trying to get one of those is going to run you a little bit pricey. That's where the Tribute 64 comes in. This controller was made by Retrobit and meant to emulate the HoriPad feeling, and size and design for a budget price, going for only about $25, which is a pretty good deal for something like this. This controller also has the dual Z buttons on the back, but they are not meant to emulate the analog, and they have that digital instant click. One thing I really like about this controller is the joystick. Just like with the HoriPad that it's trying to emulate, it has sort of that GameCube controller feel, which makes it much more comfortable for extended play sessions. The buttons also have that little glossy finish that I like about the original, as well as really good feedback. I love the little click it makes. This controller could be a little difficult if you have larger hands. However, after an extended play session, I didn't even really notice the size. It ended up being much more comfortable than I had assumed it would be. So if you've always wanted a HoriPad but don't want to shell out the extra money, the Retrobit Tribute 64 is a brilliant way to go. So the next one I want to talk about is a little more of a novelty than it is a controller, and it's this guy. This is the RealityQuest N64 Glove. Give me 1 second. So this guy's a little bit different. It is meant to be a single-handed N64 controller. Now, I'll be honest, this thing sucks. But for the sake of novelty, it's worth trying out. It's got all of the buttons displayed right on the top. The control stick is powered by a little wrist gyro. So you have your up and down, and you have your left and right. It even has these little switches that allow you to adjust the sensitivity as well as the angle and inversion of the input. I've used this thing here and there. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's something you need in a collection, but it certainly has its novelty purposes. I had a really good time the other day playing Perfect Dark. In that game, there is a mode where you can use 2 controllers at once, which was meant to sort of give you this double stick simulation. So I set it up where my second controller, meant for aiming and shooting the gun, was done with this controller, allowing me to have a vague sense of motion controls for aiming and shooting my gun. I wouldn't say it handled well, but it's worth it for the sake of doing it. It was honestly a lot of fun, and I would do it again. This controller has all of its buttons displayed right on the handpad, so you can use it with one hand. The D-pad is sort of awkwardly fiddled on the top, but you don't really use that enough for it to matter. I picked this thing up at an expo, maybe 5 or so years ago. It doesn't get much use, but it's always fun when you're having friends over to pull it out just to see the reaction to this guy. The next one I want to bring out is a third-party controller. This is just your standard, find it on the shelf. You could get these at most gaming stores. N64 controller. It does not have the official Nintendo seal on it and is made out of noticeably cheaper materials, so you could buy it on a budget price. To be honest, I can't think of many situations where you should pick one of these up because it's only going to be a little bit more if you want to find a genuine original 64 controller. Normally I would sing praise to its budget price, but now having the option to get things like the Brawler 64 or the Tribute 64, you're much better off spending the extra $5 to $10, grabbing one of those, or even shelling out the little bit extra to get yourself an officially licensed controller. I can't say I love the build quality of these. They're pretty stiff and the buttons feel a tad mushy, making it feel like you're definitely playing on a budget controller. But if you only bring your N64 out every few months to play with your friends, no one's even gonna care if you have something like this. Now that we've gone over all the controllers that I have here today, let's see how they all stack up against each other. One of the biggest things I factor into these controllers is cord length. Your TV may be on the entire other end of your living room, which may soon be remedied because Hyperkin is working on a Bluetooth N64 controller, which I will cover once I can get my hands on one. The original N64 controller comes in at 6 feet, which is noticeably short, making it kind of difficult to play in a lot of situations. I tend to have to sit on the edge of my couch just to reach the television. The cord for the Brawler, as well as the Tribute, both come in at 10 feet, making it one of the best options you can get for playing in your living room. I've never had an issue with them, and I always have enough slack to sit down on my couch and lounge and play games. The RealityQuest comes in at around 8 feet, which honestly is one of the biggest drawbacks of it. If you're using this thing, it's attached to your wrist. You're a lot more mobile when using this controller, so it falls short having such a short cable, so when I have my arm strapped into this guy, it's way difficult to play with it. Overall, the N64 has gotten many good third-party controllers, giving people multiple options to play the way they like best. I still prefer the tried and true, but I believe these other two are great options. Thank you for tuning in to the very first KotBox video. We have plenty more content along the way, and we will see you next time.